Now, I'd like for you to think for a moment about the progress of our nation. It's really remarkable. From our nation's founding, we have traveled a steady arc that trends toward prosperity, unmatched prosperity in the history of the world. From our nation's founding, we have ridden a tide of history that trends away from oppression toward freedom and equality. It is, without question, an imperfect path that we have followed. This tide of history that we ride upon today is full of all sorts of things we wish were not there. Times of injustice, ignorance, oppression, and even violence. Moments of national grief and even national failure. But the path toward improvement is inexorable and undeniable. So think for a moment, if you will, how improvement, how change happens in America. It's not always a very pretty process, but at its root is this. In both the darkest and brightest of times, Americans have always challenged America to be better. This is sometimes a noisy process, sometimes painful, sometimes meandering, this process of self-improvement. And it's this process that renders the ideals of one generation insufficient for the next. Discord, argument, struggle are as much a part of the American experience as our success, community, and virtue. We will never quiet ourselves. America will never calm down. The immense progress we have witnessed, even in our lifetimes, with all of its shortcomings, is not in spite our penchant for noisy, challenging argument. It's because of our penchant for noisy, challenging argument. Americans challenging America to be better is central to all that our nation has become. Now, the greatest challenge that Americans ever laid before America resulted in a war that left the 15,000 men who repose in this cemetery here. No doubt, there's no question that the Civil War represents a jarring, instructive failure. The only time in American history that discourse and civil action yielded to military conflict among countrymen. But still, at a distance of 150 years, it's impossible not to see the Civil War as perhaps the central event in our nation's ongoing quest for improvement. From the Civil War, the nation simultaneously changed and improved, progressed. Indeed, we study this war. We have a fascination with this war. We seek to understand it largely because it looms so large in the progress of our nation. The Civil War has shaped the nation and touched the life of every American for the last 150 years, whether you were born here or not. And it will continue to do so for the next 150 years as well. Which brings me to the more than 15,000 men who lie in this cemetery. We know not the name of more than 12,800 of them. A remarkable figure. 12,800 families suffered a loved one simply vanished, unknown. Today, as we sit here, and we're glad you're here, today as we sit here, I will ask you to consider 4 words about these men. All of these words are essential to the Americans, or were essential to the Americans who lie here, who fought on these fields, and indeed who toil anywhere at any time in our nation's interests. And all 4 words are essential to the progress of and the aspirations for our nation. Home. The story of war invariably revolves around home. Some fought to defend homes. Virtually all aspired only to reach their home once more. Separation from home was and is the war's greatest trial. In 1863, one New York soldier wrote to his wife, he said, "I dream of you often, but in my fancy I am deprived of the satisfaction in regard to Frankie's his 2-year-old son, in regard to Frankie's looks. I can remember just how Charlie, Bradley, Edith, Ed, Charlie, Lily, Tommy, Fred, Helen, and Zuler look. Yes, Diane Bryant's baby, but to save my life, I cannot imagine how Frankie used to look. And you don't know how hard that makes me feel." That soldier, James R. Woodworth of the 44th New York Infantry, died at Spotsylvania on May 8, 1864, and he almost certainly lies among the unknown graves around us. He never made it home. The deaths of these men on these fields halted journeys home for thousands and sent shockwaves through households across America, north and south, challenging the will of families, communities, states, and nations to continue. But continue they did, crippled by hardship, awash in heartbreak, civilian and soldier alike. It is a sad, difficult story, to be sure. But the hardship endured in this or any war is also a measure of the commitment and determination of those who have toiled and sacrificed on our behalf. They aspired to go home, but only after their duty was done. Home is central to our path as a nation. Hope. Hope, too, is central to our path. In 1862, Fannie Lee had been a slave for 3 decades at Santee in Caroline County. And though the Union Army suffered defeat after defeat, Fannie Lee never lost hope. She later remembered, "When the Battle of Fredericksburg ended and I heard that the Union Army had been defeated, I couldn't believe it. My mistress said to me, 'You know the Northern soldiers can't fight us here.' But I said, 'Ain't God the captain? He started this war, and he's right in front. He may stop and let you rest for a while, but our captain ain't never been beaten. Soon he'll start out again, and you'll hear the bugle blow, and he'll march on to victory. I tell you, we are going to be a free people,' she said." I told her just what I thought, Fannie later remembered. And my mistress said, "Fannie, you is so foolish." And my master said, "You ain't got no sense." But of course, Fannie was right. Her hopes were fulfilled, and decades of life as a mother and grandmother on Princess Anne Street in Fredericksburg lay ahead for Fannie Lee. Hope carried her to a life of freedom. Hope for a better life, for a better nation. Hope for their children. Pennsylvanian John Williams Patterson, who died at the Wilderness, wrote home, "My forefathers fought for my liberty, and I would be an unworthy descendant if I did not fight for the liberty of my children." Now, not all of the hopes born of the Civil War would be realized as quickly as they ought to have been, or as thoroughly as the dreamers aspired. But therein lies the cautionary power of history. For we can see in the wake of this war how quickly hopes and noble intents can be foiled. And we see something else too. The hope of one generation often requires the efforts of many to achieve. We do not live in our moment alone. We bear constantly the aspirations of those who have preceded us. Hope is the great engine that drives our constant, ongoing quest for a more perfect union. Devotion. It is one of humanity's most prized and important qualities. Devotion between a husband and wife, between parents and a child, between partners. Devotion to your job, to your church, your community, to ideals. Devotion implies the sacrifice of self-interest for something or someone else. And it makes us larger, better, individually and collectively. The devotion of men at war awes us. Their devotion to their nation, their devotion to each other. At times, it can be almost overwhelming. A young officer who came upon his regiment the morning after their first battle described them. As daylight came on, none of us could look upon our thin ranks, so full the night before and now so shattered, without tears. And the faces of these brave boys no pen can describe. The men were cheerful and quiet and orderly. The dust and blackness of battle were on their cheeks and on their clothes and in their hair and on their skin. But you saw none of these. You saw only their eyes and the shadows of the light of battle and the furrows plowed upon cheeks that were smooth the day before. I could not look upon them without tears, he said, and I could have hugged the necks of them all. Sometimes, as we look for a sense of community in our own world, or expressions of devotion in our own communities, or in our own lives, the easiest place sometimes to find them is by looking backward, to bear witness to the bonds forged by the experience of war. Devotion to family, to each other, to our community, to our nation is essential to the progress of our nation. And finally, we take for granted that men and women are willing to die for their country when called upon to do so. We presume their trust in democracy and what democracy and freedom are and what they mean to the world are inspiration enough for them. We presume their determination to protect things precious to all of us, family, our communities, our most cherished principles and traditions. We presume that their determination to protect these things will ensure our own safety, our own prosperity. We presume. But think for a moment of this transaction from the other side. What underlies their willingness to give their lives for us, if need be? Many things, of course. But one thing is faith. Faith is the foundation of the military experience. I don't mean faith in God or religion, though that's certainly important to many. I mean the faith that a soldier must have in what we ask of him or her. When we ask a soldier to fight for this nation, he or she serves because he has faith that the cause is worthy of the effort. When a lieutenant asks a private to charge across the plain at Fredericksburg in 1862, or to kick in a door in Ramadi in 2004, the private does so in part because he has faith. Faith that what he's being asked to do will somehow contribute to a larger end. That faith is what renders, by virtue of a word or a gesture or a wave or a blast of a bugle, it's what renders a nondescript place, a rise of ground or a distant fence line, suddenly worth dying for. Soldiers rarely have the perspective to see how what they are doing fits into the larger effort, but they must have faith that it does. That fiber of faith runs from the lowest private to the highest general and beyond. And when that faith is threatened or broken, armies cease to function, and causes, no matter how noble, fail. I mention this particularly today, here, because the soldier's faith extends not just to his fellow soldiers or commanding officers or general-in-chief or to the President of the United States. That fiber of faith extends to the nation beyond, to all of us. When we ask young men and women to die for our nation if need be, they agree because they have faith in us. They have faith that what we are asking of them is reasonable, just, achievable, and necessary to the health of our nation. They have faith that we will value and appreciate their efforts and their sacrifices. They have faith that should they fall, we will care for those left behind. For the grief of families is also part of the national sacrifice of war. And there's something else. It applies as much to the men who repose in this cemetery, men who died for their nation 150 years ago, as it does to the more than 35 men and women of this region who have died in Iraq and Afghanistan. They had faith that should they die, we of their generation and of all generations to follow would not forget what they had done. We are part of that vital fiber of faith that sustains our nation and inspires our men and women to serve it. The sacrifice of more than 15,000 men who lie in this cemetery is a sublime thing, to be sure. And history tells us, without question, that their sacrifice propelled our nation down an essential path of progress and improvement. But know this too, as we sit here on this beautiful afternoon. Your presence here today, too, is essential to the health of our nation. Indeed, your presence here today justifies their faith in the America that they left behind. So as we leave this place today, at the conclusion of 5 years of reflection on our nation's most trying, destructive time, I hope you will carry away a commitment to the words that have been central to the progress of our nation, and indeed central to all lives of goodness and happiness. Home, hope, devotion, and faith. And let us not fail to remember, as we stand among Americans who gave or offered all to better our land, they did not sacrifice so that we can mourn. They sacrificed so that we might live in peace, in happiness, in a land of goodness. They sacrificed that so that we could continue their quest for a more perfect union, a more secure nation, a nation of hope whose people constantly challenge each other to be better. They wanted us to remember, to be sure, as we have here today. But more than that, they offered themselves so that we might celebrate life as Americans. That was their hope. That is our charge. Thank you.